Hello and welcome to another video in Foundations of Maternal and Newborn Health. In today's video, we're going to be talking about periods of prenatal development. So periods of prenatal, so before birth, prenatal development. So to talk about this, I created a little table or a little chart. And in this second row here, this is the weeks, so the gestational age of the baby. And on the top, we'll talk about the periods. And then here is kind of diagrams of what the baby would look like during this time period. So it's not to scale. Obviously, we talked about the blastocyst before. This is just a cluster of cells. And then by 38 weeks, we have kind of a full baby. So this would be much, much larger than the blastocyst. The blastocyst is very, very, very tiny. But this is generally what it would kind of look like. Okay, so this first period here, and I just mentioned it and we've talked about it before, is the period of the blastocyst. And it's given other names as well, but we'll call it the period of the blastocyst. And as discussed, it's just a cluster of cells with a trophoblast and an inner cell mass. The second period is called the period of the embryo. And so this is when the baby is just starting to really form into a baby. And there's an important process that happens during the period of the embryo called organogenesis. And organ, of course, just means organ, like a bodily organ, like a heart or lungs or kidneys. And genesis means to grow or to develop. To grow or to develop. So a baby growing or developing organs is organogenesis. So it's the process in which the baby starts creating these organs, like the heart or kidneys or lungs or what have you. And so this last period, kind of from 12 weeks to full term, is known as the fetal period. Okay, so some of the things that I'm going to talk about here are the sensitivity of these different stages to teratogens or to compounds that cause birth defects or things that are toxic to the baby. So during this first period, during the blastocyst period, the baby or the cluster of cells at this point is very, very sensitive. So we'll call this kind of most sensitive. And what this means is that if the mother is exposed to toxins or to teratogens that might damage the blastocyst, it usually just results in death of the blastocyst. So you'll just have a miscarriage. The good thing about this is that most women won't know that they're pregnant this early on. But if a woman is drinking within those kind of first 2 weeks or is exposed to some sort of toxin, the blastocyst likely won't make it. It'll die and she'll never know that she was pregnant in the first place. During the embryo period, the baby is still very sensitive because the organs are starting to develop. The baby won't necessarily die. That's not to say that it can't, but it's more hardy or it's more resistant to death than just this cluster of cells, the blastocyst. And so what happens during the embryo period, if you're exposed to a teratogen or you're exposed to some sort of toxin to the baby, is you'll get major congenital defects. So major congenital defects, and we talked about congenital defects before. This is sort of malformations of the baby, or where the baby has inappropriate limbs or organs that haven't developed properly. And in the fetal period, at this stage, the baby is very well developed, and so exposure to teratogens will likely only cause minor congenital defects. Okay, so we're going to go through some organ systems, and hopefully it'll make sense as to why the blastocyst is the most sensitive and why the fetus is the most resistant to these congenital defects. So the first organ system we'll talk about is the central nervous system. Central nervous system. And we may have talked about the central nervous system before, but the central nervous system is just made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And so the brain and spinal cord start developing very early on, and it actually continues to develop into the fetal period, but it's most sensitive during this first period. And so what that means is that if you're exposed to a teratogen that causes problems to the brain or spinal cord in this early phase, again, you get major congenital defects of the brain or spinal cord, whereas if you're exposed to something that causes effects on the brain or spinal cord late in the pregnancy, it's less likely to cause as big of a problem. Okay, so the next system that we'll talk about is the heart. And so the heart develops very early on, and it's almost completely done development by 12 weeks. And so again, like the central nervous system, if you're exposed to a teratogen that causes a congenital defect of the heart in this embryo phase or this embryo period, you can get a major congenital defect of the heart. But again, if you're exposed to a teratogen that affects the heart late in the fetal period, chances are the baby will likely be okay. It might have a minor congenital defect, but the heart should be okay. So the last group of organ systems that we'll talk about are just a bunch of minor organ systems that all group together. So things like teeth, eyes, the mouth, and external genitalia. So external genitalia, like not the ovaries, but rather just penis and vagina is largely what we're talking about here. They develop kind of later in this embryo period and continue to develop in the fetal period. But again, they stop developing pretty early on. They'll continue to grow, but their development is largely done before full term. And so again, they're most resistant to teratogens late in pregnancy and more sensitive to it earlier in pregnancy. Okay, so throughout this video, we've talked about how these organ systems are most sensitive to teratogens while they're developing. So again, if a heart is just starting to develop, if it's exposed to a toxin that hurts its development, it's going to cause a really big issue to the heart. Whereas if that same toxin is exposed later when the heart's already done developing, that won't cause as big of an issue. But the same can be true about helpful compounds as well. And really the only example of this is folate. Folate. And this is also known as vitamin B9. Folate helps prevent a disease known as spina bifida. And so spina bifida is a disease that causes the spinal cord to remain open to the world after you're born. And so you can see this is kind of you might be able to see this is a drawing of the spine here in weeks 3, 4, and 5. You can see kind of these lines along the back of the fetus. And usually it gets closed up by the back. So on your back, your spine is kind of protected with skin and other things. But if you don't get enough folate during pregnancy, the bottom of the spine remains open to the world. So remains open through this development period. And then by the time you're born, your spine is still open to the world, but just at the bottom of the spine. So this is called spina bifida. These are also called neural tube defects, is kind of the family of diseases. And this can be prevented if the woman eats enough folate, eats enough vitamin B9. But again, the central nervous system is only developing really during this embryo period, is when the most of the central nervous system is developing, and specifically when the spinal cord closes is during this period here. And so if the woman doesn't get enough folate during this embryo period, during these first 12 months, the spine remains open no matter what. So even if you have a lot of folate in the fetal period, this won't cure the spina bifida. Once the spine is developed, if there's not enough folate, it'll remain open. And even if you have all the folate in the world after these 12 weeks, the spine will remain open. So this can't close this. They can't fix this. And so in that way, this information is important for us to know that teratogens can cause problems to these organ systems, and you have to know about kind of when these organ systems are most sensitive to those teratogens. But it's also valuable because we can give nutrients that help grow these organ systems, ideally early in the pregnancy when they're developing, and that'll help grow a really strong, healthy baby. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on was the concept of limit of viability. Limit of viability. And this is really just the age at which a baby can be born and still survive. And this is generally around 23 or 24 weeks gestation. So a baby born before 23 or 24 weeks has a very, very low chance of survival. That's not to say it's impossible. The baby could still survive, but their chance of survival is very, very low. And even at 23, 24 weeks, their chance of survival is quite low, but it's around the age at which people do survive semi-regularly. It's around 23, 24 weeks. And if you hit even 26 weeks, the chance of survival is much, much better. And so this limit of viability is also good to know.